Welcome to our new original. This week, we talk about a film that is right at the top of many fans' wish lists, The Amazing Spider-Man 3, the sequel that should have completed the trilogy starring Andrew Garfield. The reality is well known, because so far, there are only 2 movies with Garfield's Spider-Man, and for the time being, he was superseded by Tom Holland for the MCU. Yet today, we want to ask ourselves what a late sequel to the film series could look like, and why another part may not be so unlikely in the future. Enjoy! If we look at the 2 predecessors, we can derive a certain direction for The Amazing Spider-Man 3. The first, The Amazing Spider-Man movie with Andrew Garfield, was released in 2012. Something that immediately stands out, especially in the year 2022, is that the film's title alone sets it apart from the other 2 film series starring Tobey Maguire and Tom Holland. Garfield's Spider-Man is thus obviously based more on the comic book with the same title, which has been published since 1963 and is by far the most widely distributed comic book from the Spider-Man universe. From its establishment in 1963 to the 700th issue in 2012, the comic book was consistently published and is accordingly extensive. The other 2 franchises are also based more or less on these comics, but those responsible always used the original in a slightly different way, and at times incorporated a great deal of artistic freedom. However, the comic book original is not the reason that The Amazing Spider-Man 3 is once again a big topic, at least among fans. The hype surrounding Garfield undoubtedly stems from the release of Spider-Man No Way Home about a year ago, when many were taken back to the old days by the universe-spanning reunion of the 3 Peter Parkers. But back to the beginnings of The Amazing Spider-Man. The first of 2 parts was released in 2012, and thus exactly 5 years after the trilogy with Tobey Maguire, and 5 years before the trilogy with Tom Holland. Peter Parker is initially a typical teenager who lost his parents at an early age and is living with Uncle Ben and Aunt May. His father was a renowned genetic researcher, and a left-behind briefcase eventually leads Peter to former business associate Dr. Curt Connors, who is researching cross-species genetics at Oscorp Industries. As a supposed intern there, Peter is bitten by a radioactive spider, giving him his superpowers. He seeks out Connors and ends up working with him, as in the film series with Tobey Maguire. Here too, Uncle Ben is shot by a robber after an argument with Peter. This triggers great feelings of guilt in the young Peter, and results in him becoming a masked superhero to make the streets of New York City a little safer. In addition, there is of course again a crush on the main character, who here is not called Mary Jane or MJ, but Gwen Stacy. Over the course of the story, Dr. Curt Connors turns out to be a villain who, after self-testing a regeneration serum, transforms into a superhumanly fast and strong lizard. The so-called lizard then intends to subject the city's inhabitants to the same fate, but is stopped at the last minute by Spider-Man. Tragically, Gwen's father George dies in the process, and in his last minutes, begs Peter to keep his daughter out of trouble. The second part, titled The Amazing Spider-Man 2, picks up directly where the previous part ended, and first shows the turbulent superhero existence in the urban canyons of New York City. At first, more clarity is brought to the mysterious death of Peter's parents, and later, we get to see him and Gwen trying to reconcile their love lives with his existence as a superhero. Things also go their way at Oscorp. Gwen has the chance to intern there, and Peter saves the life of company electrician Max Dillon. Moreover, company president Norman Osborn dies of a strange disease that has also spread to his son. In the meantime, the rescued electrician from the beginning of the film has fallen into a tank of electric eels, and thus has been involuntarily given superpowers. After he's captured by Spider-Man and admitted to the infamous Ravencroft Institute, he begins to develop a strong hatred for Spider-Man. Harry Osborn, meanwhile, sees the Oscorp spider's venom as the last resort to cure his terminal illness. Peter, however, refuses to donate blood because of unclear implications, which leads Harry, in desperation, to release Electro, and with his help, obtain the spider venom on Oscorp's premises. This transforms him into the Green Goblin, and a final showdown ensues between the former best friends. Unfortunately, Gwen falls victim to the final fight, which in turn, Peter does not cope well with, giving up his superhero existence for a while. He does, however, return to fight the villain Rhino, recruited by Harry, with the outcome still being unclear. Let's take a brief look at the production background of The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Basically, Sony didn't want to leave it at a pure trilogy around the friendly neighborhood spider, but instead wanted to initiate an extensive franchise. In 2013, the third film was announced with a theatrical release in 2016, and 2 years later, the fourth part of the main series was supposed to kick off. In addition, 2 spin-offs were planned for the Sinister Six, as well as Venom and Carnage. The directors Drew Goddard and Alex Kurtzman were also already confirmed. The spin-offs were to be released in parallel to the main series. The plans for the Sony franchise outside the MCU were therefore quite ambitious, and the reflections were well advanced. To Sony's utter astonishment, however, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 performed poorly at the box office and generally received mixed reviews. As a result, screenwriter Roberto Orci, a pivotal member of the team, left the pre-production team to work on Star Trek Beyond. Thus, the situation was unfavorable and the movie was pushed back further. In November 2014, the hacker group Guardians of Peace infiltrated Sony Pictures and leaked a large number of internal documents. Alongside various emails between high-ranking employees, these also included details about The Amazing Spider-Man. It was revealed, for example, that Emma Stone was in talks to return in The Amazing Spider-Man 3, after which her character Gwen would have been resurrected. In addition, further films by Sam Raimi were planned, and even initial ideas for a future crossover with Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire were being discussed. However, the subsequent negotiations between Sony and Marvel over future film rights did not go in favor of The Amazing Spider-Man, and ultimately put an end to the far-reaching dreams of those responsible. Instead, in 2015, both parties concluded a deal that Spider-Man would move to the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the future, which effectively put an end to The Amazing Spider-Man as a Sony franchise. Ironically, the renewed hype around Sony's Spider-Man was created by Marvel's Spider-Man No Way Home at the end of 2021, and the speculations took off. We still don't know whether The Amazing Spider-Man 3 will ever be released. There are several conflicting statements circulating. However, one should not forget that Garfield denied his involvement in the film in the run-up to Spider-Man No Way Home more or less credibly, and we all know what the end result was, so we shouldn't give up hope for another The Amazing Spider-Man. Now that we've refreshed our memories of the two The Amazing Spider-Man films, let's turn our attention to the potential plot. Especially because of the open ending of Part 2, there are enough options to follow up with a third movie. That it is technically and legally possible to bring back Andrew Garfield is something we have known since No Way Home at the latest. A parallel universe alongside the one with Tom Holland is also conceivable, outside the MCU and as before at Sony Pictures. There is one drawback, however. By the time The Amazing Spider-Man 3 is released, Garfield will be at least 10 years older than before and well into his 40s, so there won't be much left of the youthful Spidey aesthetics by then. It would therefore not make any sense for the new film to immediately pick up where the predecessor left off, unless the final battle against Rhino had taken such a toll on him that he had aged many years in the meantime, so the plans for a sequel that were made back then are rather useless. That's why we're now looking to a few hints about a possible alternative storyline based on various sources. As early as 2015, George Stacy actor Dennis Leary talked about the proposed plot in an IGN interview. According to the interview, he himself would have played a role in the third part. In spite of his death on screen, the idea circulated that Spidey could revive his deceased companions through a mysterious magic formula, with which he could bring back George, his girlfriend Gwen, and presumably also his Uncle Ben. Indeed, this idea sounds completely absurd and would probably have been dismissed as complete nonsense if not for the statement of an actor involved. However, there is actually at least some justification for it in the comics. Through Professor Miles Warren, aka Jackal, various Spidey clones were created from Peter's DNA in the original. The same could be done with Gwen and other deceased characters. This story arc already divided the fan base when the comic was released, as it almost makes things too easy and takes away the impact and significance of the previous deaths. In 2017, director Mark Webb also spoke about the planned plot 2 years after the Amazing Spider-Man franchise was signed off. According to his statements, the also deceased Norman Osborn, who was embodied by Chris Cooper at the time, would have returned in a significantly larger role than before. In the third part, he would have taken over the role of the Green Goblin from his son after he came back from the dead. The main villain would have been Gustav Fiers, aka the Gentleman, who had no direct superpowers but can make up for it with his wealth and tricks. Later, he would have led the Sinister Six in the spin-offs. Finally, we would like to mention the role of Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy. Not only would she have returned as Peter's girlfriend, but later, she would have taken on the role as the villain Carnage. This would have adapted storylines from the Ultimate Comics and certainly created an exciting constellation. Garfield himself also commented in The Amazing Spider-Man from time to time during the years. Sometimes he denied further participation due to his age. Other times he expressed his wishes for a hypothetical The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Among these is a clash between Spidey and Eddie Brock, aka Venom, as he confirmed in the Happy Sad Confused podcast earlier this year. Additionally, there was already fan art showing him in a symbiote costume that would certainly come in handy when fighting Venom, much like in Spider-Man 3 with Tobey Maguire, at a cost, of course. In summary, there are various ideas about the storyline that don't stem from from the imagination of the fans, but rather from the statements of the people involved and the comics. We hope you enjoyed our new original episode about a possible The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and would appreciate it if you shared the video with your friends. How likely do you think a continuation of the film series with Andrew Garfield is? And which roles and storylines would you most like to see? Feel free to tell us in the comments.